The Bridge of Rosaries. Before Father Duguay's arrival, it had already been decided to build a much larger church to replace the little one that could now hold only half the parishioners who crowded to Mass in their new rosary fervor. Since the Cape itself is built on sand, stone had to be brought from the other side of the St. Lawrence River. By the summer of 1878, the stone had been prepared and was ready for transportation across the river. The only practical way to do that was over a roadway of ice. Opposite the shrine, the St. Lawrence River is over a mile wide. The rapid St. Maurice River has just come rushing down to meet the already strong flow. Its swirling around the Cape to head down for the sea makes the current especially strong and treacherous at this point. So the river, in spite of the cold winter, does not always freeze over. In the month of November, Father Desilets gave instructions for the parish to start public rosaries to obtain a bridge of ice opposite the church that winter. Each Sunday after High Mass, Father Duguay would move over to the little side altar where the statue of Our Lady of the Cape then stood. There he would lead the people in their rosary petition to Our Lady for a good solid bridge of ice. But the winter passed and no ice came. Once again, we have the trademark of so many of Our Lady's favors. Things seem to get worse immediately before they get better. Perseverance is demanded, our faith is tested, but continued prayer turns apparent hopelessness into marvelous fulfillment. The people of the Cape really had their faith tested. January and February passed. March came, and the ice floes from upstream began breaking up and flowing swiftly past Cap-de-la-Madeleine on their way to the Atlantic. Men who had known the river all their lives knew that there was no longer any hope of an ice bridge. The Sunday rosaries continued, but people began to complain about them. High Mass and a sermon was long enough without staying in to say another useless rosary for an intention that was past fulfillment. But Father Desilets had entrusted the matter to the Queen of the Rosary, and he did not lose faith in her. He ordered the public rosary continued, and he made a vow that he did not make known to the people at that time. After seeking the permission of his ordinary, he vowed that if the river froze sufficiently to bring across enough stone to allow the work to start that year, enough to build up to the windowsills, he would leave the little church standing and dedicate it to serve in perpetuity for rendering honor to the august Queen of Heaven under the title of Our Lady of the Rosary. There must have been a special power in vows made by Father Desilets. The last one was followed by the resurrection of a dead parish and the birth of a shrine. This one had as its consequences a broad ribbon of ice across the spring waters of the wide St. Lawrence and the setting apart of the little church, which is the physical center of one of Our Lady's great shrines. The feast of St. Joseph, patron of Canada, was approaching. This led the pastor of the Cape to make another promise which he shared with his parishioners. The parish would offer a special High Mass in honor of the saint if they had their ice by his feast day. The days passed. The feast of St. Joseph, patron of Canada, was approaching. This led the pastor of the Cape to make another promise, which he shared with his parishioners. The parish would offer a special High Mass in honor of the saint if they had their ice by his feast day. The days passed by up to March 14th. Most of the parishioners had stopped hoping altogether. In fact, some of the farmers among them were outspoken about the fact that they didn't want ice at this time of the year. If the ice comes now, they asked Father Duguay, when will we get our fields planted? One of them, Wansime Tupang, had some hay stored on the opposite side of the river. He went over on March 14th to have a look at it. He came back and reported to Father Duguay that there was no ice at all on the south shore. He advised the priest to give over the notion of an ice bridge and start bringing the stone across in little boats. Father Duguay told him, in the first place, the parish could not afford such a costly business. In the second place, some of the foundation stones weighed over 3,000 pounds and cannot be brought across that way. And in the third and most important place, They were going to have their bridge of ice within a week. Taupin shook his head and said that he was going over by boat to bring back his hay. The priest asked him why he didn't wait a week and use Our Lady's bridge of ice. Taupin laughed at the priest's innocence in believing in the impossible. He joined a companion, Brière, who also had hay on the other shore, and the two rowed across over clear water to the far side of the river. Brière brought his first load of hay, leaving Taupin waiting by the remainder for his return. But Brière couldn't get back. They had picked exactly the wrong moment. In order to get home, Taupin had to make his way to a point opposite Three Rivers, cross over, and walk back down to the Cape. But his journey had made one point clear for the record. The river was definitely open and navigable by a small boat on March 14, 1879. On that day, Father Duguay tells us, a great wind stripped the mouths of the St. Maurice. That could only mean that it freed the jammed ice floes to go sailing into the St. Lawrence. Saturday was a heavy, overcast day. On Sunday morning, the river seemed to be covered over as far as a few hundred feet below the church. The parishioners were still not impressed. This was a light, temporary covering which would soon wash away. Nevertheless, Father Duguay followed his pastor's instructions, said the rosary again, announced that the High Mass promised to St. Joseph would take place on Wednesday at 8 o'clock, and added that he himself was going out with some others after Vespers to seek a way across the ice. There are men still alive who were at that Mass as children, and they remember the amused skepticism of their parents as well as their low opinion of the sanity of anyone who would accompany Father Duguay out on that river. After Vespers, Father Disselet, still unable to leave the house, was to preside at a meeting of the members of the Fabrique who ran the temporal affairs of the parish. The meeting gives another clear example of the lack of any natural hope for a bridge of ice. These good men, the closest friends of the pastor, spent the meeting opposing his desire to sign a contract for stone for the facade of the new church. It had been decided that the contract should go to Damasno of St. Albans, but the prudent guardians of the parish funds could not bring themselves to share the priest's certainty that Our Lady would provide a bridge that year. With hard-headed reasoning, they held that since the stone could not be brought over this year, it was not to the advantage of the parish to sign such a contract so far ahead. While this was going on, Father Duguay had started out with a group of men under the leadership of Firmin Cadeau and Flavien Bourassa. First they went straight down the bank in front of the church, and they were encouraged to find that the ice along the edge, which was usually crumbled away by the flow from the mill spring at this time of year, held firm. But the firmness only went a little way out, so they started making their way downriver, looking for a more promising spot. Firmin Cadeau was in the lead. He had an axe in his hand to test the ice and a rope tied round his waist. Flavien Bourassa held the other end of the rope, tensed to take weight at any sudden movement and pull Firmin back from a wet grave. Next came Father Duguay, heavy coat over his soutane, big galoshes flopping on the ice, and his youthful eagerness betraying itself by impatient thrusts of his cane into the frosted snow that covered the water where the ice ended. Then came the others, keeping an attentive eye on the youngsters. They kept going down without being able to get very far from shore for a distance of about 15 arpents. The arpent, though really a square measure, roughly equivalent to an acre, was often used as a measure of length, probably from the width of an arpent of land. But Father Duguay has left no guesswork about where they were. In front of the property then occupied by Damas Dorval, they were at the little bay below the Shrine Dock, where the paper mill now unloads its timber. There they found a line of ice floes going straight out into the river. Friday's storm had put snow on the river and splashed water over it to form a frosty covering which bridged the intervals between the floes. The largest of the floes was something over 100 yards, its length stretching across the breadth of the river, and 50 feet wide. The gaps between the floes varied. Some were only 5 or 10 feet apart, Others were separated from each other by 20, 30, 50, or even 100 feet of frosted snow. The men decided that this was the place to search for a crossing. Before they started, they did something which proves that not everyone had come thus far undamaged. They lit a fire to dry out the feet of some of the group who had stepped right through to the river to find cold, wet proof that the frosted snow was not solid ice. Father Duguay is most insistent on this point about the frost-snow covering that joined the ice floes. Obviously, the great danger of the whole business lay in crossing those fragile bridges between the more solid floes. Nevertheless, they made their way out into the river. Firmin Cadeau testing each step carefully to find in which direction he should turn for the more solid footing. Father Duguay, on his part, seems to have been so fascinated by the fact that they were walking on something it wasn't possible to walk on, that he had to keep proving it to himself time and time again. All during this crossing I kept pushing my cane through to the current of the river, as easily as if you push a stick into a bank of snow piled up by the wind. The scarcely credible truth that they were finding a path to support their weight within arm's length of snow-covered water was given confirmation a little later. Darkness was beginning to fall as Flavien Bourassa made his way back from the south shore. He got down on his hands and knees so that he could feel ahead with his hands for a place to put his knee. On several occasions the groping had plunged straight into icy water. At the very last minute it looked as if the whole risky journey had been in vain. They were standing on the last ice floe, and the south shore still lay about 400 yards in front of them, with nothing but snow-covered water in between. But they were not going to give up at that point without exploring every possibility. One of the men went cautiously, circling around, and came upon a spot where the storm-tossed current had laid ridges of hard, though not very strong ice over the frozen snow. Firmin Cadeau, still in the lead, followed by Flavien Bourassa, faithfully holding the rope, and Father Duguay, poking his impatient cane, were the only three who dared follow this precarious path. It took off on a diagonal line about 500 yards long till they stood on the south shore directly opposite the church. They had made the crossing. The bridge of ice was a reality. But it wasn't anything you could cart tons of stone across. There was still much to be done. The first obvious job was to flood water over that fragile diagonal stretch and strengthen it to a reasonable thickness of ice. Then the same must be done from ice floe to ice floe all the way back to the other side. Father Duguay gave words to the question that was in all their minds. What do we do now? Without hesitation, Firmin Cadeau answered, "Get me some men and we'll do the work." Bourassa saw another immediate job. "It's getting dark. We'll have to mark the road. I'll do it." So while the others went off to gather men, Flavien found some small bushes to stick upright in the snow, marking the path to be followed and strengthened. It was on his way back from doing this that he had to get down on his hands and knees in the dark at the precarious diagonal and keep turning away from the open water that flowed so dangerously close. Father Duguay bounced back into the presbytery like the eager young curé he was. As he landed in the middle of the meeting that was still deadlocked, "I've just come back from the south shore," he burst out. "Everything is fine. By the grace of God, we'll have it." That ended the meeting. The contract was approved and given out. The young assistant did not linger in the presbytery. He sought out Taupin, the man of the stranded hay, and asked him to drive him around the parish to round up some men. The men rallied around Father Duguay, and Father Duguay was back at the presbytery by 8 o'clock after having toured the parish as far out as the St. Maurice River. He found Father Desilets worrying about the responsibility of letting so many men expose their lives, but he was too excited about the wonderful arrival of the humanly impossible bridge to let such thoughts sink into his mind. Till 11 o'clock that night, 30 men worked in the light of 3 torches, flooding that fragile diagonal passage without one of them so much as wetting a foot. It was during this work that one man made the remark that first gave the bridge its name. He looked over at the lighted window in the presbytery and said, "It isn't the ice that's holding us up. It's the good Father's rosary." It wasn't a bridge of ice they were on, it was a bridge of rosaries. A total of 64 men poured layer after layer of water, as one does when flooding a rink, over the frosted snow spaces between the ice floes all the way across. Those passages they made just wide enough for one vehicle. Any passing would have to be done on the larger ice floes. It was a starlit night, but dark with no moon. One could recognize only shapes and voices. At 11 o'clock, Firmicado straightened his back and said to the men, "I'll be back at 2 a.m. Their reply was as straight and strong as the quiet challenge of his brief statement. "Send somebody to wake us up and we'll be with you." The men of the Cape were convinced that heaven had sent them a miracle which demanded their cooperation, and they were ready to give it. As Father Desailly puts it, with a touch of levity seldom seen in his writing, the thing appeared to be providential, and it seemed to invite the parishioners to action. The men were back at work at 3 a.m. to ensure their labor of the previous night by flooding the bridge to a stronger thickness of ice before the sun could get at it. But instead of the sun came dirty weather, a hazy fog and light snow that threatened to go soft. Father Duguay felt very discouraged when he climbed back to the presbytery at 7:30 that morning. But he tells us in another of his delightfully revealing asides, "I felt better after having something to eat." The men worked through 2 days and 2 nights, continually flooding the roadway to an ever more satisfying strength. From the presbytery windows, the shifting pattern of their torches made a weird picture in the night. Father Desailly described it, and at the same time reveals that he was keeping vigil while they work, in these words: "There was nothing more beautiful and at the same time more strange than to see in the night their flaming torches coming and going, now moving slowly, now rapidly over that newly formed ice, and reflected on the waves of the surrounding water." That passage also provides incidental evidence that the ribbon of ice was bordered by open water. While the men worked, their women and children stayed home and kept up a chain of rosaries that matched the men's labors hour by hour. Among the details gathered last year from the old people, who were then children, is the memory of being prodded by a mother to get up and keep walking around the table so as not to fall asleep while saying the rosaries that were the support of that bridge. There is no doubt at all that the people of the Cape looked upon the bridge of ice as a bridge of rosaries and a miracle sent from heaven at Our Lady's hands. At noon on Tuesday, March 18th, just as the Angelus bell was ringing on the vigil of St. Joseph's feast, the first load of stone arrived in front of the church. Its driver, Joseph Lanville, was presented with a bouquet to honor the occasion. This first load came while men were still clearing the regular path from the river to the church, so it was hauled up the bank where the way of the cross now stands. Several other loads were hauled that afternoon. By that time the parish was thoroughly stirred up over the phenomenal bridge which had come up so surprisingly to answer the Sunday rosaries they had thought in vain. At 6 o'clock that evening, Father Duguay once more called on Toupin to drive him. This time his message was that the bridge was safe and sound and the first stone had already come across. The High Mass, in honor of St. Joseph, would be sung at 7 instead of 8. The men were to come in their working clothes, the farmers bringing their horses and vehicles. But the women and children were not to come. They were to stay home and keep on saying the rosary. Father Desailly would not have been human had he not stopped to compare that happy, enthusiastic body of men trooping into the midweek Mass with the people who had left him alone with an empty church in the days before they had received the message of the rosary. If he had had no other proof of the power of Our Lady's favorite devotion, the scene in front of his eyes would have been of itself sufficient to silence any doubt. After the Gospel, Father Duguay read a letter from the pastor. It was a simple message telling them to take every precaution, but to have no fear. Our Lady would look after them. That was a Wednesday, St. Joseph's Day. The parade back and forth across the river continued until the following Wednesday. The men relieved each other in half-day spells. But Father Duguay seems to have been out with both shifts. He tells us that he said his Mass at 11:45 when the horses were having dinner. Word of the strange event in Cap-de-la-Madeleine passed quickly around the region. Old parishioners came back to lend a hand. On Sunday, 175 carts were counted. There were only 70 farmers in Cap-de-la-Madeleine. Crowds from 3 rivers thronged the riverbank to see with their own eyes the unbelievable fact that at this time of year, a freak, narrow bridge of ice with open water alongside it had formed right opposite a church that had been praying for it, and was strong enough to carry a procession of carts, each loaded with 1 or 2 tons of stone. When the ice bridge began to break up on March 26th, they estimated the stone they had carted and discovered why the bridge was sweeping away. They had just enough to build the new church up to the windowsills. The people of the Cape had kept their part of the bargain, and Our Lady and St. Joseph fulfilled theirs. As a pleasing postscript to the story of the Bridge of Rosaries, it can be added that Once-a-May Toupin was rewarded for driving Father Duguay all over town. On March 20th, he was allowed to slip his hay wagon in between 2 loads of stone. But even out in the middle of the river, sharing the ribbon of ice with about 50 tons of stone, we feel sure that he was still shaking his head and saying that the bridge wasn't possible.